We all use chemicals every day, in our homes and in our workplaces. They are part of our lives. If used properly, they are safe and effective. But if we don't know the hazards, serious accidents can occur. Industry relies on the powerful properties of chemicals to clean, dissolve, stabilize, and weld. However, if not handled properly, hazardous materials can cause damaging or deadly side effects. WHMIS stands for Workplace Hazardous Materials Information System. WHMIS was developed jointly by government, industry, and labor to protect workers who handle hazardous materials. There are three main parts to WHMIS: labels, material safety data sheets, and worker education. Its purpose is to put information about hazardous materials into the hands of the workers. The supplier label and the symbol on it are part of the Workplace Hazardous Materials Information System, or WHMIS. Under WHMIS legislation, your employer is required to create an inventory of the hazardous materials in your workplace and make sure that they are properly identified. Your employer must also instruct and train workers who are likely to be exposed to hazardous materials. Additional information for each hazardous chemical must be made available in the form of a Material Safety Data Sheet, or MSDS, which comes with the product. This data sheet will tell you how this chemical can hurt you if used improperly, how to safely handle and store it, and what to do in an emergency situation. MSDS gives you detailed information about the material and how to handle it safely. Workers have a responsibility to use this information to protect themselves from the harmful effects of hazardous materials. Jonathan Skidmore was on the job only 3 days. The work seemed simple enough. Pour the chemical xylene from a large container into a smaller one. The supplier label identified this chemical as flammable and combustible. Jonathan knew that flammable and combustible means more than simply not smoking in the area. You also have to make sure there is no equipment nearby creating sparks, flames, or heat, or take precautions to prevent the buildup of static electricity. Without warning, the chemical burst into flames. The fire burned 80% of Jonathan's body. How could this senseless tragedy have been prevented? Jonathan's employer should have told him that certain liquids may cause static electricity to build up while they're being poured. The fire that burned Jonathan was started by static electricity. To prevent static electricity from building up, you must ground the large container to a ground in the building. Then, you must bond the larger container you are pouring from to the smaller container you are pouring into. Jonathan did not know this. He died 3 days later in hospital. Flammable and combustible materials can be ignited in many different ways. Do you know what they are? Jobs that create sparks or heat, such as grinding, cutting and welding, unprotected electric plugs, unprotected lighting, or an overhead heater. Vapors can travel a long distance to an ignition source, causing a disaster. Do you have any of these ignition sources in your workplace? If you work with materials that have this symbol, the material is flammable or combustible, and you should avoid ignition sources. On July 21st, 1994, Ed Pollock, a maintenance worker at a packaging facility, found a leaking drum. The drum contained hazardous materials. It should have been labeled, but the label had been torn off. Now, put yourself in Ed's position. What would you do in this situation? A, clean up the spill immediately to prevent the chemical from spreading. B, try to identify the chemical by smelling it or touching it. C, call your supervisor. If you chose A, this is exactly what Ed did. Ed began to clean up the spill. But something wasn't right. Had a fellow worker not found him within a short period of time, Ed would have died from the serious health effects of the chemical. If you had chosen B, to try and identify the chemical by smelling it or touching it, it could be unsafe. For instance, if the chemical happened to be corrosive, Ed could have been badly burned. For those of you who chose C, to call your supervisor, you are correct. The drum had no label on it. Therefore, the chemical could not be identified. If Ed had seen this symbol, he would have known the material inside was a serious toxic substance. Chemicals with the skull and crossbones symbol may cause immediate and serious health effects, such as loss of consciousness, coma, or death within minutes or hours of exposure. The supplier label would have told him what the material is, the name of the supplier, to refer to the material safety data sheet, the hazard symbol, the effects of harmful exposure, how to handle the material safely, first aid measures. The supplier label always has a distinctive border, and it is presented in English and French. Every supplier is required by law to label all hazardous materials with this information. Your employer is also required to ensure that the label stays on